Today we're going to be looking at my book called A Nation Turns Back to God, which is Nehemiah Part 2, or Nehemiah chapters 8 through chapters 13. This is a very hard book to study because of the name situations. Again, the names can either be placeholders for the family name represented rather than individual people. We know that they're not the same people as Ezra. We know that because they would all be 94 years of age or older. And so that's impossible. So that's why we have to just assume that they're placeholders or representations of the people that originally came. We went ahead and looking at the table of contents here. We have already completed chapter 1, where now let's look at the history. The first 7 chapters of Nehemiah, they have built the wall. So now they're going to be basically in celebration of that wall, reasonably. But in chapter 1, Ezra comes and takes the scrolls of Ezra and Deuteronomy, of Genesis and Deuteronomy, and starts reading it to the people in the public. And it's taking from daybreak till noon to read it. And he has a lot of people standing with him. So that happens, and they realize that they should be celebrating Rosh Hashanah, or the Feast of Trumpets. So the people are all sent back to celebrate the Feast of Trumpets. So now in chapter 2, celebrating the Festival of Tabernacles, which is Nehemiah 8:13 through 18. On the second day of the month, the heads of all the families, along with the priests and the Levites, gathered around Ezra the teacher to give attention to the words of the law. They found written in the law, which the Lord had commanded through Moses, that the Israelites were to live in temporary shelters during the festival of the 7th month. Now we actually have a problem. In Nehemiah 8:1 through 12, the people celebrated the Festival of Trumpets, which is celebrated on the first day of the 7th month. Now, in this chapter, they'll be celebrating the Festival of Tabernacles. What happened to the Day of Atonement, which should be between the two? A theory will be shown on the next page. Which day of the month is this? This is the second day of the month, and it's the month of Tishri, the 7th month. Who is the group of listeners made up of this time? Heads of all the families, along with priests and Levites. We seem to have an addition, and we definitely have one group that isn't there. How is this group different than the prior page? It's heads of all the family rather than the men and women who can understand. So it isn't so much the women. What did they discover in the words of the law? The Israelites were to live in temporary shelters during the festival of the 7th month. Looking at what the Bible says about the festival or tabernacles on page 27, what day is it supposed to start in the 7th month? It's supposed to start on the 15th day of the 7th month. And the Festival of Tabernacles on page 27. I'm not sure if we've seen that yet. Anyway, maybe it's the next page. Anyway, so here's the next page. What happened to the Day of Atonement in Acts 8? They skipped the Day of Atonement. Now, I will tell you what happens to it in a bit, but we are trying to figure out why. Now, this theory is given by Bible hermeneutics. Assumption: Nehemiah 8 begins with Ezra reading only from Deuteronomy, not Genesis. Ezra is reading the law of Moses. It's reasonable to conclude the books of Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers. While these do have legal elements, they would also be considered as the historical record of Moses receiving the law. That in the context of all 5 books, Deuteronomy is a singular work of which the Lord commanded Israel. So that's why they may have just read from Deuteronomy. Ezra read from early in the morning till midday, a period too short to read all 5 books. 13 Levites helped the people who remained in their place to understand what Ezra read and give sense so the people understood what they heard. This is not describing a simple reading, rather, it describes a time consuming process of reading and explaining. Ezra could not have gotten very far in reading even a single book. Since the instruction is for all the people and the Levites are assisting, it's reasonable to exclude Leviticus. Leviticus is really for the priests. Supporting evidence from Deuteronomy. The feasts in Deuteronomy are found in chapter 16, and only Passover, weeks, and tabernacles are described. The people did not observe the Day of Atonement, which was not included in Deuteronomy. So that's another support that Deuteronomy was the book that was read. The Festival of Tabernacles in Deuteronomy is described only as a 7-day fast. There's no instruction as to what day or month the fast is to be observed. Since Deuteronomy identifies the time for Passover and weeks, and it was obvious those had been missed during the Tabernacles, observing Tabernacles is logical and did not conflict with anything in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy speaks to one place where the people are to worship, Deuteronomy 12. To that place, the people are to bring their free will offerings, and in that place, the people are to eat, rejoicing before the Lord. That is what is described being taken place in the observance of tabernacles in Nehemiah. Deuteronomy 16 gives attention to giving gifts and to justice, the same instruction given in Nehemiah 8:10. So those are great supporting evidences about the fact that Ezra may have just read from from Deuteronomy. One evidence against the assumption, the only aspect of Nehemiah 8 that is contrary to the Deuteronomy only reading is found at 8:18, Nehemiah 8:18. They kept the feast 7 days, and on the 8th day there was a solemn assembly, according to the rule. Deuteronomy describes tabernacles as a 7th-day event. There's no mention of the 8th day, which is described only in Leviticus. Well, we'll deal with this when we study verse 18. Okay, so that's that if you were ever concerned about that problem. Anyway, getting back to the scripture. Nehemiah 8:15. And that they should proclaim this word and spread it throughout their towns and in Jerusalem. Go out into the hill country and bring back branches from olive and wild olive trees, from myrtles, palms, and shade trees to make temporary shelters, as it is written. What are they to do with the new knowledge of the Festival of Tabernacles? They were to proclaim the knowledge throughout their towns and in Jerusalem. What kind of branches were they to bring in Jerusalem? Olive branches, myrtle, palms, and shade branch trees. The best number of people we have at this time is based on the numbers that Nehemiah gives us in chapter 7 below. Adding all three numbers below, how many people were probably in the area at this time? Okay, Nehemiah 7, 66 to 67. The whole company numbered 42,360. Besides, there's 7,337 male and female slaves. They also had 245 male and female singers. So if you add all those out, the amount is 49,942. And that would be men. According to the detail from the JewishRoad.com below, what would happen in these temporary shelters? What is the Festival of Tabernacles? From the JewishRoad.com, Jews build a temporary shelter called a sukkah and eat their meals in the shelter for 7 days to commemorate their time in the desert when they had little to no shelter and lived under the stars. Okay. And so what does the Bible tell us about the Festival of Tabernacles? It was already established before they even stopped living in tents as they traveled to the Promised Land. So God already established it before they even had that 40 years of wandering. Leviticus 23, 33, 36. The Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, on the 15th day of the 7th month, the Lord's Festival of Tabernacles begins, and it lasts for 7 days. The first day is a sacred assembly. Do no regular work. For 7 days, present food offerings to the Lord, and on the 8th day, hold a sacred assembly. Present a food offering to the Lord. It is a closing special assembly. Do no regular work. Then Deuteronomy 16, 13 through 15. Celebrate the Festival of Tabernacles for 7 days after you have gathered the produce of your threshing floor and your winepress. Be joyful at your festival, you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, and the Levites, the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns. For 7 days, celebrate the festival to the Lord your God at the place the Lord will choose. For the Lord your God will bless you in all your harvest and in all the work of your hands, and your joy will be complete. Number 2 is celebrated when the first group of people returned to Jerusalem after the exile, which would have been in Ezra. Ezra 3, 1 through 4. When the 7th month came and the Israelites had settled in their towns, the people assembled together as one in Jerusalem. Then Joshua, son of Jehozadak, and his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and his associates began to build the altar of the God of Israel, to sacrifice burnt offerings on it, in accordance with what is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Despite their fear of the people around them, they built the altar on its foundation and sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and evening sacrifices. Then, in accordance with what is written, they celebrated the Festival of Tabernacles with the required number of burnt offerings prescribed for each day. So that's what the Bible talks about for the Festival of Tabernacles. Nehemiah 8:16. So the people went out and brought back branches and built themselves temporary shelters on their roofs, in their courtyards, in the courts of the house of God, and in the square by the water gate, and the gate by the gate of Ephraim. Where did they make the temporary shelters or succots? They built it on their own roofs, in their courtyards, in the courts of the house of God, in the square near the water gate, and by the gate of Ephraim. Circle the water gate and the gate of Ephraim. Okay, so we know the water gate is right here. The gate of Ephraim. Ah, I see it. If needed, refer to map on page 3. Note, Ephraim Gate was not specifically mentioned during the rebuilding of walls in Nehemiah. It is possible that it was left standing and therefore did not have to be rebuilt. Number 3, the Festival of Tabernacles was to remind them of the time they spent traveling in the wilderness for 40 years. According to page 27, did God establish it before they even stopped living in tents? Yes, absolutely. He's establishing it now before they even had the 40 years wandering in the wilderness. Why? Again, for people to realize that God knows all things. Nehemiah 8:17. The whole company that had returned from exile built temporary shelters and lived in them. From the days of Joshua, son of Nun, until that day, the Israelites had not celebrated it like this, and their joy was very great. Who participated in the Festival of Tabernacles? I believe it said everyone who had returned from the exile, that is, every Jew living there, and all the people that returned. The Festival of Tabernacles was not celebrated like this one since when? Since Joshua, son of Nun. So now we have a problem. Joshua, son of Nun, is the Joshua that led the Israelites into the promised land in the book of Joshua. And all the travels and occupation that are listed in the book of Joshua, the Festival of Tabernacles is never shown. However, in the book of Ezra, shown below, the Festival of Tabernacles was celebrated after the first group of people arrived in Jerusalem with Joshua as the high priest. Ezra 3, 1 through 4. When the 7th month came and the Israelites had settled in their towns, the people assembled together as one in Jerusalem. Then Joshua, son of Jehozadak, and his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and his associates began to build the altar of the God of Israel to sacrifice burnt offerings on it, in accordance with what is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Despite their fear of the people around them, they built the altar on its foundation and sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and evening sacrifices. Then, in accordance with what is written, they celebrated the Festival of Tabernacles with the required number of burnt offerings prescribed for each day. Okay, did the writer of Nehemiah mean Joshua, son of Nun, or Joshua, son of Jehozadak? I think he means Joshua, son of Jehozadak. Even though it's not specifically listed, do you think the Israelites celebrated the Festival of Tabernacles when they occupied the land of Israel with Joshua, son of Nun? More than likely, because they were going through God's direction. And so I imagine they still were doing the various festivals, in my opinion. Of course, they're occupied in a land that they're still conquering, but in my opinion. Do you think from the days of Joshua son of Nun until that day the Israelites had not celebrated it like this has to do with the amount of enthusiasm rather than the event itself? Yes, I think the amount of enthusiasm, in my opinion. Nehemiah 8:18. Day after day, from the first day to the last, Ezra read from the book of law of God. They celebrated the festival for 7 days, and on the 8th day, in accordance with the regulation, there was an assembly. If they read only from Deuteronomy, then they would not have known. They would not know about having an assembly on the 8th day. However, in the week of readings, they could easily have gone through the other books of law of God, which would have included Leviticus and Numbers that have the 8th day celebration. Ezra read from the book of law of God from the first day to the last. How many days would this have been? 7 days. What did they do on the 8th day? They assembled. What exactly happens on the 8th day? The verses and numbers shown below tells us more. There are 4 different offerings to be given on that day. What are they? Numbers 29, 35 to 38. On the 8th day, hold a closing special assembly and do no regular work. Present an aroma pleasing to the Lord, a food offering consisting of a burnt offering of 1 bull, 1 ram, and several male lambs a year old, all without defect. With the bull, the ram, and the lambs, offer their grain offerings and drink offerings according to the number specified. Include 1 male goat as a sin offering in addition to the regular burnt offerings with its grain offerings and drink offering. So it looks like they have 4 different types of offerings. Interesting, the 8th day holds special significance in the Bible. Note the following. Boys are to be circumcised on the 8th day. Aaron and the first priests were consecrated on the 8th day. Solomon dedicated the temple on the 8th day of the Festival of Tabernacles. So now we come to the end of this chapter and see what we can come up with here. Number 3, what were the people to bring from the olive, myrtle, palms, and shade trees? The branches. 6, in Nehemiah 8, the people go from the Feast of Trumpets to the Festival of Tabernacles and did not have the Day of Atonement. Number 8, the Festival of Tabernacles happens during what Jewish month? 7th Jewish month. On the 8th day, what did the people have? An assembly. 1 down, who read from the book of law of God? Ezra. 2, during the Festival of Tabernacles, the people live in temporary shelters, temporary shelters. 4, the writer said that the Festival of Tabernacles had not been celebrated like this since Joshua, son of Nun. 5, the instructions for the Festival of Tabernacles are listed in Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Is that correct? Where is it? Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Right, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They made shelters in front of 2 gates, the water gate and the gate of Ephraim. So that's the end of this chapter. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, it's a tough chapter with all the names that we don't understand. Have a good day.